this is Nina. Welcome to NV Fine Art Studio. Today I'm comparing violets. Until recently, I never had a tube of violet. I have always mixed my own just to add them to other blends, especially for shadows and to neutralize warm colors. The repetition started to bother me, so I purchased an ultramarine violet. I was very pleased with the shade, bluish purple, but for a dark pigment it is very weak, so I decided to replace it. This time I have a few options to compare. I have carbazole violet from Daniel Smith, mineral violet from Holbein, and a cheap alternative, deep violet from Jackson's Artist Watercolor range. I am very interested to see how they perform. Before we start, just a reminder, if you like my style of painting and would like to learn it, I have a full demo on my Patreon. I give a very detailed explanation of what I do and most importantly why. If you want feedback on your artwork, be sure to sign up for Masterclass Community tier. Without further ado, let's go! First I would like to show you the violet that I already have. This is ultramarine violet. I really like the color. It's a slightly bluish violet and it has a very light opaque nature to it. But the problem is, as I said before, it's simply not dark enough. The value that you see on the swatch is the darkest you get from it. I painted straight out of the palette with a very minimal amount of water on the brush and it's still around 7 to 8, which is quite weak for dark. It is slightly opaque, I don't mind it visually, but I think it affects its wet into wet quality. It doesn't move on its own as much as I would like. I would assume it's due to being semi-opaque and having some fillers or white paint in it. It's like having rocks in your pockets and trying to swim. I think it also affects dry brush marks. It's hard to be precise with it. It feels like it has an odd consistency and it's hard to make an even line. The top two lines show exactly what I mean. I got a hang of it by line number 3, 4 and 5. It's okay, it's not a big deal, but I think it's good to mention. Okay, this is my current color. Let's move on to the new ones. First we'll do Daniel Smith, carbazole violet, then mineral violet from Holbein, and then deep violet from Jackson's Artist range. This is Daniel Smith, carbazole violet, pigment PV23, only one, which is supposed to be good. Usually it is associated with a clean paint. I'm not an expert, so I cannot comment on it too much. I already squeezed it here on my palette and added a bit of water. So far, it looks very rich and pure. Let's see how it performs on the paper. I'm really interested in how dark it can get. This is a butter consistency, so it's quite thick. So wow, this is dark. This is really dark. This is exactly what I was looking for. Let's spread this across a little and add a bit of water and see how it performs. Very nice transition, very nice. I really like it. And it doesn't look like it stains too much actually. I would assume it's around value 9, but let's see against the value chart. It's actually really close to value 10, somewhere in between 9 and 10, but I assume because it's wet and probably when it gets dry it will be slightly lighter. But so far so good. Just for comparison, my current color is around probably 7, 8, which is not very dark. Now let's test wet into wet. So I'm going to add a bit of water on the paper. Now I'm picking up very thick pigment and dropping it into the wet surface. Oh, this is a very good dispersing. In comparison to my previous color, it's amazing. It definitely looks really good. It moves really well on the paper. I'm sure we will see even better results in a few minutes, but so far it moves really well on the paper. Now let's test dry brush marks and fine lines, because this is where the quality of pigment consistency matters. Oh, this is a beautiful pigment. I have so much more control in comparison to the sample above. It is definitely a pleasure to work with. Quite often I mix my colors on the paper, so I really want to see how it mixes with other colors on the paper. So I'm going to pretend painting a tree. First I'm gonna do a cooler tree, like a typical green tree, and then I'll probably do a autumn tree. This is my green summer tree. Let's assume the sun is shining from the right top corner and add the shadow to the left. First, I want to see if I like the color, and second, how nicely the shadow paints itself. The wet into wet is really good. It creates very nice bokeh. Let's add a bit of water and see how far we can take it. In terms of color harmony, I think bluish violet is a very good color to use as a shadow. If you don't like the intensity, you can always add a bit of yellow ochre or raw sienna. So far so good, I really like it. Let's test it on an autumn tree and see if we still like it. So far so good, no complaints here. I can definitely see clearly the veins of the violet spreading into the gold here. Let's add darkest darks and see how thicker pigment spreads. This is very good. I should say that in general Daniel Smith is a really good brand, and if you have a similar style of painting, I definitely recommend it. And the last thing that I forgot to do is to test staining properties, so let's do it right now. I'm quickly going to drop a little bit of pigment and do a washout with my flat synthetic brush. It lifts quite well. It definitely doesn't leave the white paper behind. It still stains. So I should say probably it's light to medium because we still can see the color. Okay, now I want to do a little conclusion before we move on to Holbein Mineral Violet. First, value range. I'd say the darkest is around 9 and 10. 9 over here and 10 in the darkest area where I used pure pigment, and my previous color is around probably 8, 7, 8. The tone is a cool violet, very versatile. My previous color is slightly warmer than carbazole violet in comparison. I definitely prefer Daniel Smith, and I can see myself using it pretty much everywhere. Number 3, granulation. I noticed it is slightly granular, similar to my old color. Honestly, I'd prefer it to be more granular, similar to ultramarine, but it's okay, no big deal. Wet into wet, this is really beautiful. I cannot paint myself like that. My old color didn't do this. I can see similar effects on the trees that I painted, and it doesn't really matter if I added water or darker color. The result is a beautiful dispersity. This is what I'm after, for a pigment that has a mind and life of its own. And the last one is the dry brush technique. It's definitely easy to control and have no complaints here. Okay, let's move on to Holbein Mineral Violet. If I'm not mistaken, it consists of 3 pigments, PB29, PR122 and PBR125, so it is a mix of black, red and brown. Some may say it's not a good thing, but personally I don't mind. I like complex tones and usually mix a lot of colors together anyway. My first impression, it's definitely a warm violet. It's a red violet. Let's assess the value range. This is very dark. I'd say it's value 9 to 10, very similar to Daniel Smith. Let's move it across and add a bit of water and see the variety of values. It looks like it has a great variety of ranges. This is great. I can add it to my lights and middle values, and the most important thing, I can add it to my darks and get a rich and vibrant color. Very happy with this. Let's assess wet into wet. I am pre-wetting a little area with clean water and I am adding a thick paint to see how it disperses. So far, I am very impressed. I think I prefer it to Daniel Smith. The veins are much more prominent, the bokeh effect is much stronger, the paint mobility is just insane. Definitely a big plus. Now let's test staining and color lifting. I think it lifts really well. It's definitely not a staining color, it doesn't look like it's staining color. It lifts really well with my synthetic brush. Let's test the tissue. Very similar result with the tissue. Yep, it lifts really well. Oh my god, look at this beautiful variation in tone. I'm not sure if it's the black and the browns in this paint that we can see through, but it's so gorgeous. I really like this violet. I think I want to double check the composition of this paint. Yes, it looks like black, red and brown. So maybe that's what we see here. I'm not sure, I'm not an expert. If you know anything about pigments, please leave a message below, share it with us. I'd be very glad to know more. Now let's do the tree test and see how it mixes with other colors on paper. This is our pretend tree, let's drop in some color. This is quite good, I have no issues here. I'm dropping it into a damp, almost dry surface and the wash is still doing a nice job. Obviously it's the wrong color for a shadow, but it still looks good, I actually quite like it. Let's test the autumn tree. I definitely prefer this color combination. I think it's actually quite good for the fall season. I'm dropping the wash into reasonably damp surface and observing a very similar effect as we see above. Beautiful. Now I'm dropping a much thicker pigment into the painting and hopefully we'll be witnessing a slight movement. So far so good. Let's quickly test the dry brush marks and fine line. All good here, no complaints. And before we move on to Jackson's Artist Deep Violet, let's summarize. In value range, it is very similar to Daniel Smith from 1 to 10. In tone, it's a red violet in comparison to my old color blue violet and Daniel Smith blue violet, but I'm quite happy with having a variety. Wet into wet, this is amazing. This is just blew my mind. The transition in hues, the softness of bokeh, the variety of values, this is great. I cannot wish for more. And finally, Jackson's Artist Violet Deep Hue. This is a cheaper paint, I think it was almost half price. I'm curious if it's cheaper because of the quality or due to the fact that it is an in-house Jackson's Art paint and they can do a lower margin. I never tried it before and I think it will be a good test to understand if it's worth spending your money on expensive paints. First, let's compare the pigments. It's PB29 and PR122. I think it's very similar to Holbein. Let's check. So yeah, this is PB29, PR122 and PBR25. So Jackson's doesn't have brown. Let's see how it looks. I can definitely see it doesn't have brown in it now. It's a cooler and more neutral violet, but I'm not impressed with the amount of paint I spent on this little puddle. With Daniel Smith and Holbein, it's enough just to touch the paint, and here I have used almost half of what I put on the palette. Here's where my money savings went south, I think. And also it looks a little bit more opaque. I wonder if it's the fillers or just the paint feature. Let's have a look. First, let's test the tonal value range. Looks incredibly similar to my old color in terms of value. I'd say it's between 6 and 7 and definitely not as a greater range as Daniel Smith and Holbein. Okay, let's compare wet into wet. Okay, this is very disappointing. Let's do a few more brush strokes. It doesn't move. It's dead, it's not moving. It's not breathing. Honestly, I'm not a fan. I'm starting to suspect it is a cheaper paint with lots of filling. Personally, it's a very big deal when the paint doesn't move on the paper. If you're a beginner, you haven't developed the good brushwork skills to move the paint, and when paint is not doing it for you, it is a road to bad final result. I cannot believe how obvious this is. Please, if you're a beginner, do not waste your money on cheap paints and cheap paper. You set yourself for a failure. Okay, let's quickly do a lift test and the tree test, just in case I'm all judging it too quickly. I think it's a staining color. I tried my best to lift. I used my synthetic brush and also a tissue. It definitely got lighter, but it's still there. And finally, the tree test. We are testing how it mixes with other colors on paper. Unfortunately, it is the same result here. It is not moving freely. I have much more paint on my brush when I do the paint drop to help it a little, but it feels very controlled. And the border between the green and the violet is very obvious. No lovely bokeh here, unfortunately. And if we drop the water, it feels like it just flows down. No mixing in between the colors. Okay, I think I'm ready for the conclusion. First, value range, and it's between 1 and 7 and very similar to my old color. The tone is neutral, so it is very versatile. It is slightly cooler than the Holbein Mineral Violet and much warmer than Daniel Smith Violet. Staining, it's definitely a staining color. It's very hard to lift. So if I were to use it in my darks and I want to do a highlight, it will leave a pink highlight, not a white one. Wet and to wet, it doesn't move freely. It doesn't do fine bokeh, and overall, in comparison to the other brands, it just doesn't look like a professional painting. It just looks odd. And the last point that I want to make, I used at least twice as much paint to do the same amount of work. It felt like I'm picking up paint on my brush, but it just disappears into nothing. So, as a result, it doesn't look like much saving there, unfortunately. This is it for today. I hope this was informative. If you like this video, please like, subscribe and share. I will look forward to seeing you in my next video.